Question 1. The performance metrics show a significant backlog in processing license to carry a firearm applications in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Considering the legal framework governing firearm licensing, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with U.S. Virgin Islands law while upholding public safety? Option A. Base application decisions on the applicant's personal opinions or perceived character, rather than the specific legal criteria for firearm licensing. Option B. Deny applications based on the applicant residing in areas with higher reported crime statistics, irrespective of individual background checks. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of each application, verifying residency, performing thorough background checks for disqualifying criminal history or mental health adjudications, and confirming the applicant's stated good cause against the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Chapter 23. Option D. Expedite applications by performing only a cursory review of submitted documents, assuming the applicant meets all requirements unless immediately obvious discrepancies are present. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of each application, verifying residency, performing thorough background checks for disqualifying criminal history or mental health adjudications, and confirming the applicant's stated good cause against the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Chapter 23. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the processing of license to carry a firearm applications within the U.S. Virgin Islands. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the constitutional right to bear arms with the paramount public safety mandate of the U.S. Virgin Islands. A failure to adhere strictly to the established legal framework can lead to both the issuance of permits to individuals who pose a risk and the wrongful denial of permits to eligible citizens, potentially resulting in legal challenges and erosion of public trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure due process, thorough vetting, and consistent application of the law. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of each application against the specific criteria outlined in the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Chapter 23, concerning the issuance of firearm licenses. This includes verifying the applicant's eligibility, ensuring they meet residency requirements, conducting thorough background checks for any disqualifying criminal history or mental health adjudications, and confirming they have a demonstrable good cause for needing a firearm as defined by the statute. This method is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory requirements for firearm licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands, prioritizing both individual rights and public safety through a legally mandated, objective review process. It ensures that decisions are based on established legal standards, not subjective interpretations or expediency. An approach that prioritizes expediting applications by relying solely on a cursory review of the submitted paperwork without independently verifying critical information, such as the applicant's residency or conducting a comprehensive background check, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the statutory obligation to ensure applicants are qualified and do not pose a risk, violating the spirit and letter of Title 14, Chapter 23, which mandates a thorough vetting process to protect public safety. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to deny applications based on generalized concerns about crime rates in certain neighborhoods without specific evidence linking the applicant to any disqualifying factors. This constitutes arbitrary and capricious decision-making, failing to adhere to the individualized assessment required by law. It also infringes upon the rights of law-abiding citizens by imposing a burden not supported by the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing statutes. Finally, an approach that focuses on the applicant's perceived socioeconomic status or personal beliefs as a basis for denial, rather than the legally defined criteria for eligibility, is ethically and legally flawed. Such a practice is discriminatory and directly contravenes the non-discriminatory application of laws mandated by the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Chapter 23. This involves systematically evaluating each application against each statutory requirement. When ambiguities arise or potential disqualifying factors are identified, the framework should include protocols for seeking clarification, conducting further investigation, and consulting with legal counsel if necessary, ensuring that all decisions are well documented, legally defensible, and consistently applied. Question 2. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to clarify the process for evaluating applicants for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm who have a documented history of a police report for a disturbance, even if no charges were filed or a conviction resulted. An applicant, Mr. John Smith, has such a report from 5 years ago, but has otherwise maintained a clean record. He states he was acting in self-defense during the incident and has since taken a firearm safety course. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Issue a warning to Mr. Smith regarding the past incident and grant the license, without a detailed assessment of the incident specifics or his current suitability. Option B. Grant the license immediately without further investigation, assuming that the absence of charges or a conviction means the applicant is suitable. Option C. Automatically deny the license application due to the existence of a police report for a disturbance, regardless of the outcome or the applicant's subsequent record. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the police report and any related documentation, interview Mr. Smith if necessary, and assess whether the circumstances of the prior incident, in conjunction with his overall record and recent firearm safety training, demonstrate he is not likely to be a danger to himself or others. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the police report and any related documentation, interview Mr. Smith if necessary, and assess whether the circumstances of the prior incident, in conjunction with his overall record and recent firearm safety training, demonstrate he is not likely to be a danger to himself or others. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing an individual's right to self-defense with the stringent public safety requirements mandated by the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing laws. The applicant's past behavior, while not resulting in a criminal conviction, raises concerns about their temperament and judgment, which are critical factors in determining suitability for carrying a firearm. Careful judgment is required to avoid both arbitrary denial and the potential endangerment of the public. The best professional approach involves a thorough, individualized assessment of the applicant's character and suitability, directly addressing the concerns raised by the prior incident. This means reviewing all available documentation, including the police report and any statements from the applicant, and considering whether the circumstances of the prior incident demonstrate a pattern of behavior that would make the applicant a risk to themselves or others if granted a license. This approach aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework, which allows for denial of a license if the applicant is deemed likely to be a danger to themselves or others, or if they have demonstrated poor judgment in situations involving potential violence. Ethical considerations also demand a balanced approach that respects individual rights while prioritizing public safety. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of a police report, regardless of its outcome or the applicant's subsequent conduct. This fails to acknowledge that a police report does not equate to a conviction, and that individuals can demonstrate rehabilitation, or that the incident was not indicative of future dangerousness. Such an automatic denial would be arbitrary and potentially violate due process. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the license without any further inquiry into the circumstances of the prior incident, assuming that the absence of a conviction means the applicant is automatically suitable. This disregards the licensing authority's responsibility to assess suitability beyond mere legal eligibility and could lead to the issuance of a license to an individual who may pose a risk. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to base the decision solely on the applicant's stated belief in their right to self-defense, without objectively evaluating their past conduct and its implications for public safety. While the right to self-defense is a consideration, it does not supersede the licensing authority's duty to ensure responsible firearm ownership. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence, due diligence, and a balanced consideration of individual rights and public safety. This involves 1. Gathering all relevant facts, 2. Assessing those facts against the specific legal criteria for licensing, 3. Considering the applicant's character and temperament, and 4. Documenting the rationale for the final decision thoroughly. Question 3. Regulatory review indicates that an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that did not result in a conviction. Considering the U.S. Virgin Islands statutory framework for firearm licensing, which of the following actions best represents the applicant's most prudent and legally compliant course of action regarding this prior arrest. Option A. Omit any mention of the arrest from the application, assuming that a non-conviction renders it irrelevant to firearm eligibility. Option B. Independently conclude that a non-convicted arrest is not a disqualifier under U.S. Virgin Islands law and therefore does not need to be disclosed. Option C. Fully disclose the arrest, including the charges and the fact that it did not result in a conviction, and provide any supporting documentation available to clarify the outcome. Option D. State on the application that they have had a prior arrest, but do not provide details about the charges or the disposition, hoping it will not be a disqualifying factor. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the arrest, including the charges and the fact that it did not result in a conviction, and provide any supporting documentation available to clarify the outcome. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm to navigate potentially conflicting information regarding their eligibility. The applicant has a prior arrest that did not result in a conviction, and the critical factor is how this is interpreted under U.S. Virgin Islands law concerning firearm possession. The applicant must understand that the legal standard for firearm eligibility often extends beyond mere convictions to include certain types of arrests and the circumstances surrounding them, especially if they indicate a propensity for violence or a disregard for the law. Careful judgment is required to ensure the application is complete, accurate, and compliant with all statutory requirements, avoiding misrepresentation or omission of material facts. The best professional approach involves a thorough and transparent disclosure of all relevant information to the licensing authority. This means proactively providing details about the prior arrest, including the charges, the disposition, non-conviction, and any supporting documentation that clarifies the outcome. This approach aligns with the principle of full disclosure mandated by firearm licensing regulations, which aim to assess an applicant's suitability and public safety risk. By being upfront, the applicant demonstrates honesty and allows the U.S. Virgin Islands Police Department or relevant licensing body to make an informed decision based on the complete factual record, as per Title 23, Chapter 15 of the Virgin Islands Code, which governs firearm licenses and outlines disqualifying factors. An incorrect approach would be to omit the arrest entirely, assuming that a non-conviction automatically negates any relevance. This failure to disclose is a direct violation of the application's requirement for truthful and complete information and can lead to the denial of the license or revocation if discovered later. It also suggests an intent to mislead the authorities, which is a serious ethical and legal breach. Another incorrect approach is to only provide partial information about the arrest, such as stating it occurred but not clarifying the non-conviction outcome or providing supporting documentation. This can create suspicion and necessitate further investigation by the licensing authority, potentially delaying the process and raising concerns about the applicant's candor. Finally, attempting to interpret the law independently and deciding that the arrest is irrelevant without explicit confirmation from the licensing authority is a risky strategy that could lead to a misunderstanding of the U.S. Virgin Islands specific legal standards for firearm eligibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and adherence to the specific legal requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands. This involves carefully reviewing the application form for any questions related to arrests, charges, or legal encounters, and answering them truthfully and comprehensively. When in doubt about the interpretation of a legal requirement or the significance of a past event, it is prudent to seek clarification from the licensing authority or consult with legal counsel experienced in U.S. Virgin Islands firearm law. The goal is to present a complete and honest picture to the authorities, enabling them to conduct their due diligence effectively and make a lawful determination. Question 4. Performance analysis indicates a firearm dealer in the U.S. Virgin Islands is processing a sale of a handgun. The applicant claims to have initiated the process for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm and has provided a receipt from the Commissioner of Public Safety's office. Which of the following actions best upholds the regulatory framework governing firearm sales in the U.S. Virgin Islands? Option A. Sell the firearm and advise the applicant to submit their license application to the Commissioner of Public Safety after the transaction. Option B. Proceed with the sale, accepting the applicant's receipt as proof of their ongoing license application. Option C. Conduct a federal background check (NICS) and consider it sufficient to authorize the sale. Option D. Verify that the applicant possesses a valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm issued by the Commissioner of Public Safety before completing the sale. The correct answer is D. Verify that the applicant possesses a valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm issued by the Commissioner of Public Safety before completing the sale. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearm dealer in the U.S. Virgin Islands due to the stringent requirements for obtaining and maintaining a license to carry a firearm. The dealer must navigate the specific legal framework of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which dictates the process for background checks, application submissions, and the responsibilities of licensed individuals. Failure to adhere to these regulations can result in severe penalties, including license revocation and criminal charges. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring absolute compliance with the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, specifically Title 14, Chapter 13, which governs firearms. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously verifying that the applicant possesses a valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm issued by the Commissioner of Public Safety before completing the sale of any firearm. This approach directly aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Section 2253, which mandates that no person shall sell, lend, give away, or otherwise transfer any firearm to any person who has not obtained a license to carry the same. The dealer's responsibility is to act as a gatekeeper, ensuring that only legally authorized individuals acquire firearms, thereby upholding public safety and adhering to the law. This proactive verification is the cornerstone of responsible firearm sales within the territory. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the sale based solely on the applicant's assertion that they have applied for a license, without independent verification. This fails to meet the statutory requirement of possessing a *valid, issued license at the time of transfer. It places undue reliance on the applicant's word and bypasses the legal safeguard established by the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a federal background check, such as the NICS check, is sufficient to satisfy local U.S. Virgin Islands requirements for firearm transfers. While federal checks are a component of firearm sales, Title 14, Chapter 13 of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code imposes additional, territory-specific requirements, including the mandatory possession of a local license to carry. Relying solely on a federal check ignores these crucial local mandates. A further incorrect approach is to sell the firearm and then instruct the applicant to submit their license application to the Commissioner of Public Safety afterward. This is fundamentally flawed as it reverses the legal order of operations. The law requires the license to be obtained prior to the transfer of the firearm, not as a post-transaction formality. This approach demonstrates a severe misunderstanding of the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm transfer regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in firearm sales must adopt a compliance-first mindset. This involves thoroughly understanding and strictly adhering to all applicable federal, territorial, and local laws governing firearm transactions. When faced with a situation involving licensing requirements, the decision-making process should prioritize obtaining definitive proof of compliance with the specific jurisdiction's mandates. This means actively seeking and verifying required documentation, such as a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, before any transfer of ownership occurs. If there is any ambiguity or lack of required documentation, the sale should be postponed until full compliance is achieved. This systematic approach minimizes legal risk and upholds ethical responsibilities. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a past interaction with law enforcement that did not result in a conviction. The applicant is unsure how to address this on their application. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for obtaining a firearm license in the U.S. Virgin Islands? Option A. Omit any mention of the interaction with law enforcement, assuming that since no conviction occurred, it is not relevant to the application. Option B. Disclose the interaction but only provide a vague summary, omitting specific details about the nature of the police involvement or its outcome. Option C. Fully disclose the interaction, providing all relevant details and any supporting documentation, and explain any mitigating circumstances or evidence of rehabilitation since the event. Option D. Disclose the interaction but focus solely on the fact that no charges were filed, without offering any further context or explanation. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the interaction, providing all relevant details and any supporting documentation, and explain any mitigating circumstances or evidence of rehabilitation since the event. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate a complex application process for a sensitive privilege. The applicant's past interactions with law enforcement, even if not resulting in conviction, can be perceived as indicators of potential risk by licensing authorities. The challenge lies in accurately and completely disclosing all relevant information, while also presenting mitigating circumstances, ensuring compliance with the specific legal framework of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Misrepresentation or omission can lead to denial and potential legal repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and transparent disclosure of all past interactions with law enforcement, regardless of the outcome. This includes providing details about the incident, the date, the location, and the disposition, e.g., charges dropped, acquittal, fine paid. Crucially, this approach also entails proactively providing context and any evidence of rehabilitation or positive change since the incident. This aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands licensing requirements, which mandate truthful and complete applications. By being upfront and providing context, the applicant demonstrates honesty and a willingness to comply with the spirit and letter of the law, allowing the licensing authority to make an informed decision based on a full picture. This approach respects the licensing body's need to assess suitability and risk. Incorrect approach is analysis. Failing to disclose any interaction with law enforcement, even if no charges were filed or the case was dismissed, is a direct violation of the application's requirement for full disclosure. This omission constitutes misrepresentation and can lead to immediate denial of the application and potentially future bars from applying. It suggests an intent to conceal information, undermining the applicant's credibility. Disclosing the interaction but downplaying its significance or omitting key details, such as the specific nature of the police involvement or the outcome, is also a form of misrepresentation. While not a complete omission, it still fails to provide the licensing authority with the complete and accurate information necessary for a proper assessment, thereby violating the spirit of the disclosure requirement. Providing only the bare minimum information about the interaction without any context or explanation of subsequent positive actions or rehabilitation efforts may be technically compliant with disclosure, but is professionally suboptimal. It leaves the licensing authority to make assumptions based on limited data, potentially leading to an unfavorable decision. While not an outright misrepresentation, it misses an opportunity to proactively address potential concerns and demonstrate suitability. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a proactive and transparent approach. The decision-making process should involve a careful review of the U.S. Virgin Islands specific statutes and regulations pertaining to firearm licensing. This includes understanding what constitutes a disqualifying event and the required level of disclosure for any past encounters with law enforcement. The applicant should gather all relevant documentation related to the incident and prepare a clear, concise, and truthful narrative. If there are mitigating factors or evidence of rehabilitation, these should be documented and presented alongside the disclosure. The goal is to provide the licensing authority with all necessary information to make an informed and fair decision, demonstrating honesty and a commitment to responsible firearm ownership. Question 6. The monitoring system flags an individual in the U.S. Virgin Islands whose license to carry a firearm expired last week, but who has submitted a renewal application and claims to be legally permitted to continue carrying until the new license is issued. Based on U.S. Virgin Islands firearm regulations, what is the most appropriate professional guidance to provide? Option A. Inform the individual that they can continue to carry their firearm as long as they have their expired license and the pending renewal application, as this demonstrates intent to comply with U.S. Virgin Islands firearm regulations. Option B. Advise the individual that they are not legally permitted to carry a firearm until their license to carry is officially renewed and in their possession, as possession without a valid, unexpired license is a violation of U.S. U.S. Virgin Islands law. Option C. Advise the individual that they can continue carrying their firearm until they receive an official denial notice for their renewal application, as the absence of a denial implies continued permission under U.S. Virgin Islands law. Option D. Suggest that the individual contact local law enforcement for an informal opinion on whether they can continue carrying in the U.S. Virgin Islands while their renewal application is processed. The correct answer is B. Advise the individual that they are not legally permitted to carry a firearm until their license to carry is officially renewed and in their possession, as possession without a valid, unexpired license is a violation of U.S. Virgin Islands law. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential lapse in adherence to the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing regulations, specifically concerning the renewal process and the implications of an expired license. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the legal framework governing firearm possession and the immediate consequences of non-compliance, balancing the individual's rights with public safety mandates. The core issue revolves around whether an individual can legally possess a firearm after their license to carry has expired, even if a renewal application is pending. The correct approach involves recognizing that possession of a firearm without a valid, unexpired license to carry is a violation of U.S. Virgin Islands law. Therefore, the most prudent and legally compliant action is to advise the individual that they are not legally permitted to carry a firearm until their license is officially renewed and in their possession. This aligns with the principle that legal privileges, such as carrying a firearm, are contingent upon maintaining current licensure. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 14, Chapter 13, specifically addresses the licensing and regulation of firearms. While the law may provide a grace period or specific procedures for renewal applications, the act of carrying a firearm is generally prohibited without a valid, issued license. The emphasis is on the current validity of the license, not merely the intent to renew. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a pending renewal application automatically grants the right to continue carrying a firearm. This overlooks the explicit legal requirement for a valid, unexpired license to be in effect. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on informal assurances from law enforcement or a vague understanding of the renewal process, without consulting the specific statutes and regulations. This demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the precise legal requirements. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the individual that they can continue carrying until they receive a denial notice, as this places the burden of proof and legal risk on the individual and potentially allows for illegal possession. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes strict adherence to the letter of the law. This involves 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction's laws and regulations governing the matter, in this case, U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing. 2. Ascertaining the current legal status of the individual's license. 3. Advising the individual based on the clear legal requirements, without making assumptions or relying on informal interpretations. 4. Documenting all advice given and ensuring it is consistent with statutory mandates. Question 7. The assessment process reveals an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was subsequently dismissed. Considering the specific regulatory framework of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Automatically deny the firearm license application based on the existence of any arrest record, irrespective of the charge's dismissal. Option B. Rely on general knowledge of firearm licensing laws in other jurisdictions to make a determination regarding the dismissed charge's impact on the U.S. Virgin Islands application. Option C. Proceed with issuing the firearm license without further investigation into the dismissed misdemeanor charge, assuming it has no bearing on eligibility. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, including the dismissed charge, and consult the U.S. Virgin Islands Code to determine if a dismissed misdemeanor arrest, without a conviction, disqualifies the applicant from obtaining a firearm license. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, including the dismissed charge, and consult the U.S. Virgin Islands Code to determine if a dismissed misdemeanor arrest, without a conviction, disqualifies the applicant from obtaining a firearm license. Explanation: the assessment process reveals a scenario where an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was subsequently dismissed. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to balance the applicant's right to privacy and the presumption of innocence with the U.S. Virgin Islands public safety mandate and the specific requirements for firearm licensing. The licensing authority must navigate the nuances of how dismissed charges are treated under U.S. Virgin Islands law concerning firearm permits. Best professional approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's complete criminal history, including the dismissed charge, and understanding how the U.S. Virgin Islands Code specifically addresses the impact of dismissed arrests on firearm license eligibility. This approach requires consulting the relevant statutes and regulations governing firearm licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands to determine if a dismissed misdemeanor arrest, even without a conviction, constitutes a disqualifying factor. If the law permits and no other disqualifying factors exist, the applicant may still be eligible. This aligns with the principle of due process and avoids penalizing individuals for charges that did not result in a conviction, provided the governing law allows for such consideration. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of an arrest record, regardless of its disposition. This fails to adhere to the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework, which often distinguishes between arrests and convictions. Such an approach could violate the applicant's rights and lead to legal challenges. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the dismissed charge entirely and proceed with the license issuance without any inquiry. While the charge was dismissed, the licensing authority has a duty to conduct a comprehensive background check and assess all relevant information to ensure public safety. Overlooking any part of the applicant's history, even if seemingly minor, could be a dereliction of this duty. A further incorrect approach would be to rely on general assumptions about dismissed charges without consulting the specific U.S. Virgin Islands statutes. Different jurisdictions have varying rules regarding the impact of dismissed charges on licensing. A generalized assumption could lead to an erroneous decision that is not supported by the applicable law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the specific legal requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands. This involves 1. Identifying the precise legal standards for firearm license eligibility under the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. 2. Conducting a complete background investigation, including obtaining records of all arrests and their dispositions. 3. Applying the law rigorously to the facts, paying close attention to how dismissed charges are treated. 4. Documenting the decision-making process thoroughly, referencing the specific legal provisions relied upon. Question 8. The assessment process reveals an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was subsequently dismissed. Considering the U.S. Virgin Islands Code governing firearm licensing, which of the following represents the most appropriate professional approach to evaluating this applicant's suitability? Option A. Base the decision on informal reports or rumors concerning the dismissed incident without seeking official documentation or clarification. Option B. Disregard the dismissed arrest entirely, assuming a dismissal negates any potential concerns about the applicant's suitability. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's entire history, including the circumstances of the dismissed arrest, to determine if the dismissal indicates a lack of probable cause or raises other concerns relevant to suitability under 14 V.I.C. Section 2253. Option D. Automatically deny the license based on the presence of any arrest record, irrespective of the final disposition. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's entire history, including the circumstances of the dismissed arrest, to determine if the dismissal indicates a lack of probable cause or raises other concerns relevant to suitability under 14 V.I.C. Section 2253. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was later dismissed. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to balance the applicant's right to privacy and the public safety mandate of the licensing authority. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code, specifically Title 14, Chapter 23, governs firearm licensing and outlines the criteria for disqualification. A key aspect is understanding how dismissed charges are treated under the law and the discretion afforded to the licensing authority. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's entire history, including the circumstances surrounding the dismissed arrest, and a determination of whether the dismissal indicates a lack of probable cause or was based on other factors that might still raise concerns about the applicant's suitability. This approach aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework, which emphasizes public safety while also considering due process. The licensing authority must assess if the underlying conduct, even if not resulting in a conviction, demonstrates a propensity for violence or a disregard for the law that would disqualify the applicant under 14 V.I.C. Section 2253, which lists disqualifying offenses and conditions. A comprehensive background check that includes the disposition of all arrests, even those dismissed, is crucial. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of an arrest record, regardless of its disposition. This fails to acknowledge that a dismissal often signifies that the charges were unfounded or could not be proven, and it may violate principles of fairness and due process. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the arrest record entirely, assuming a dismissal means no further inquiry is necessary. This neglects the licensing authority's duty to ensure the applicant is not a danger to themselves or others, as mandated by the public safety provisions of firearm licensing laws. Finally, an approach that relies on hearsay or unsubstantiated information about the dismissed incident, rather than seeking official records and a clear understanding of the dismissal's basis, is professionally unsound and could lead to an arbitrary decision. Professionals in this situation should employ a structured decision-making process. First, gather all relevant official documentation regarding the arrest and its dismissal. Second, understand the specific legal provisions in the U.S. Virgin Islands Code pertaining to firearm disqualifications and the treatment of dismissed charges. Third, assess the applicant's overall character and suitability based on the totality of the circumstances, including any explanation provided by the applicant. And fourth, make a decision that is consistent with the law and promotes public safety without unfairly penalizing the applicant for charges that were not sustained. Question 9. The assessment process reveals an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was subsequently dismissed by the court. Considering the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 23, Chapter 15, which of the following approaches best reflects the required due diligence and legal standards for evaluating this applicant's suitability? Option A. Request a detailed explanation from the applicant about the arrest and dismissal without independently verifying the court's disposition of the case. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's entire record, including the circumstances surrounding the dismissed arrest and any other relevant information, to determine if the applicant is a suitable person to possess a firearm in accordance with U.S. Virgin Islands law. Option C. Automatically deny the license application solely because an arrest record exists, irrespective of the dismissal of the charges. Option D. Grant the license application without further investigation, assuming that a dismissed charge poses no disqualifying factor. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's entire record, including the circumstances surrounding the dismissed arrest and any other relevant information, to determine if the applicant is a suitable person to possess a firearm in accordance with U.S. Virgin Islands law. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a prior arrest for a misdemeanor offense that was subsequently dismissed. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to balance the applicant's right to privacy and the presumption of innocence against the U.S. Virgin Islands public safety mandate and the specific requirements for firearm licensing. The licensing authority must determine if a dismissed arrest, even without a conviction, poses a risk that disqualifies the applicant under the relevant U.S. Virgin Islands statutes. The best professional approach involves a thorough, individualized review of the applicant's history, focusing on the specific circumstances of the dismissed arrest and any other relevant information. This approach aligns with the principles of due process and fair consideration, while still upholding the public safety objectives of the firearm licensing laws in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Specifically, the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 23, Chapter 15, concerning firearms, outlines the criteria for licensing. While convictions for certain offenses are clear disqualifiers, the statute also grants discretion to the licensing authority to consider other factors that may indicate an applicant is not a suitable person to possess a firearm. A dismissed arrest, without further context or evidence of ongoing issues, may not in itself demonstrate unsuitability. Therefore, a comprehensive review, potentially including an interview with the applicant and examination of court records pertaining to the dismissal, is crucial to make an informed decision that adheres to the spirit and letter of the law. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of an arrest record, regardless of its dismissal. This fails to acknowledge the legal principle that an arrest is not a conviction and that dismissed charges do not establish guilt. Such an approach would be a regulatory failure, as it bypasses the nuanced assessment required by U.S. Virgin Islands law, which allows for consideration of the totality of circumstances. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the license without any inquiry into the dismissed arrest, treating all dismissed charges as if they never occurred. This would be an ethical failure and a potential regulatory oversight, as the licensing authority has a duty to investigate all information that could bear on an applicant's suitability and public safety. The licensing authority must exercise due diligence. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a fact-based, legally compliant, and ethically sound assessment. This involves 1. Identifying all relevant legal requirements and discretionary factors under U.S. Virgin Islands law. 2. Gathering all available information pertaining to the applicant's history, including official records of arrests and their disposition. 3. Conducting a thorough and individualized review of the information, considering the nature of the offense, the reasons for dismissal, and any other factors that might indicate risk. 4. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the final determination. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not arbitrary, but are grounded in a comprehensive understanding of the law and a commitment to public safety and individual rights. Question 10. Cost-benefit analysis shows that an individual in the U.S. Virgin Islands is considering purchasing a handgun for $750. To legally carry this handgun, they must obtain a license to carry. The application fee for this license is $100, the background check fee is $50, and the license is valid for 2 years, with a renewal fee of $75. If the individual plans to carry the handgun for a total of 5 years, what is the total minimum cost they must budget for the firearm and its legal carryover this period, assuming no changes in fees? Option A. $750 firearm plus $100 application plus $50 background check plus $150 estimated renewal equals $1,050. Option B. $750 firearm plus $100 application plus $50 background check plus $75 renewal 1 plus $75 renewal 2 plus $75 renewal 3 equals $1,125. Option C. $750 firearm plus $100 application plus $50 background check plus $75 renewal 1 equals $975. Option D. $750 firearm plus $100 application plus $50 background check equals $900. Correct answer is B. $750 firearm plus $100 application plus $50 background check plus $75 renewal 1 plus $75 renewal 2 plus $75 renewal 3 equals $1,125. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the financial implications of a firearm purchase against the legal requirements for obtaining a license to carry in the U.S. Virgin Islands. A firearm owner must not only consider the upfront cost, but also the ongoing expenses and the potential for future regulatory changes that could impact the legality or cost of ownership. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, thereby avoiding legal repercussions and ensuring responsible firearm ownership. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive financial assessment that explicitly accounts for all statutory fees associated with the U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, including application fees, background check fees, and any renewal fees, in addition to the purchase price of the firearm. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal mandate to secure a license and ensures that the individual can afford to maintain legal possession and carry rights. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 23, Chapter 15, outlines the requirements and fees for firearm permits. By calculating the total cost, including these legally mandated fees, the individual ensures they are making a financially sound decision that aligns with regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to solely consider the purchase price of the firearm and ignore the mandatory licensing fees. This fails to acknowledge the legal obligation to obtain a license to carry, which incurs specific costs. Such an oversight could lead to an individual possessing a firearm without the legal authority to carry it, resulting in potential criminal charges under U.S. Virgin Islands law. Another incorrect approach would be to estimate licensing fees without consulting the official fee schedule. This could lead to underestimation of costs, potentially leaving the individual unable to pay the required fees and thus unable to obtain a legal license. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to the precise requirements set forth by the U.S. Virgin Islands authorities. A further incorrect approach would be to assume that the purchase price of the firearm is the only relevant financial consideration, disregarding the ongoing costs associated with maintaining a license, such as renewal fees. This overlooks the continuous nature of legal firearm possession and carry rights, which require periodic renewal and associated payments. The professional reasoning framework for such situations involves a multi-step process. First, identify all legal requirements for the intended action, in this case, carrying a firearm in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Second, research and quantify all associated costs, including purchase price, mandatory fees, and ongoing expenses. Third, perform a comparative analysis of these costs against available financial resources. Finally, make a decision that ensures full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, prioritizing legal and ethical conduct. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that an applicant in the U.S. Virgin Islands is seeking a license to carry a firearm. Considering the specific legal framework of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which of the following actions represents the most compliant and professionally sound method for the applicant to pursue this license? Option A. Submit an application to the Superior Court without the certificate of good moral character, assuming it can be provided later if requested. Option B. Directly petition the governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands for a firearm license, bypassing the standard application and background check procedures. Option C. Obtain a certificate of good moral character from the police commissioner, undergo a background check, and submit a complete application package to the Superior Court for review. Option D. Rely on a verbal confirmation from a police officer that the applicant meets the general criteria for firearm ownership. The correct answer is C. Obtain a certificate of good moral character from the police commissioner, undergo a background check, and submit a complete application package to the Superior Court for review. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the complex legal landscape of firearm ownership and licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands, balancing personal rights with public safety obligations. A failure to adhere strictly to the established protocols can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the denial of essential rights. The onus is on the applicant to demonstrate not only eligibility, but also a thorough understanding and compliance with the specific requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously gathering all required documentation as stipulated by the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Chapter 17, Title 23, specifically focusing on the firearm licensing provisions. This includes obtaining a certificate of good moral character from the police commissioner, undergoing a thorough background check, and demonstrating a legitimate reason for possessing a firearm. The applicant must then submit this comprehensive package to the Superior Court for review and approval. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the statutory requirements for obtaining a license to carry a firearm, ensuring that all legal prerequisites are met, thereby minimizing the risk of denial or legal repercussions. Incorrect approach is analysis. Submitting an incomplete application without the required certificate of good moral character from the police commissioner is an incorrect approach. This directly violates the explicit procedural requirements outlined in the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, making the application invalid from the outset and leading to its automatic denial. Relying solely on a verbal assurance from a law enforcement officer regarding eligibility, without obtaining the formal certificate of good moral character and submitting a written application, is also an incorrect approach. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code mandates a formal, documented process for firearm licensing, and informal assurances do not substitute for these legal requirements. This failure to follow the prescribed legal channels undermines the integrity of the licensing process. Attempting to bypass the Superior Court review process by directly petitioning the governor for a firearm license without first fulfilling the statutory application and background check requirements is an incorrect approach. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code clearly delineates the jurisdiction and process for firearm licensing, and circumventing these established legal pathways renders the request invalid and potentially illegal. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a systematic and compliant approach. This involves thoroughly researching and understanding the specific statutes and regulations governing firearm licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They should prioritize obtaining all mandated documentation and following the prescribed application procedures precisely. When in doubt, seeking clarification from official sources, such as the U.S. Virgin Islands Police Department or the Superior Court Clerk's Office, is crucial. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to legal compliance and public safety, ensuring that all actions taken are within the bounds of the law. Question 12. The evaluation methodology shows that when reviewing an application for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, what is the most professionally sound method for addressing an applicant's history that includes documented instances of domestic disputes and restraining orders, even if these incidents did not result in criminal convictions? Option A. Issue the license without further inquiry, as the absence of criminal convictions means the applicant meets the basic legal requirements for firearm possession. Option B. Request a psychological evaluation of the applicant solely based on the existence of restraining orders, without considering the context or severity of the underlying disputes. Option C. Deny the application immediately based on the mere presence of documented domestic disputes, regardless of the details or outcomes of those incidents. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and circumstances of the documented domestic disputes and restraining orders, seeking additional information from relevant parties if necessary, to assess the applicant's overall suitability and adherence to the spirit of U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing laws. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and circumstances of the documented domestic disputes and restraining orders, seeking additional information from relevant parties if necessary, to assess the applicant's overall suitability and adherence to the spirit of U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing laws. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that navigating the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing process requires a nuanced understanding of both statutory requirements and the practical implications of applicant history. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the applicant's right to self-defense, as recognized by law, with the licensing authority's duty to ensure public safety. The licensing officer must meticulously assess information that could indicate a disqualifying factor, even if not explicitly stated, as a criminal conviction. The best approach involves a thorough and objective review of all submitted documentation, coupled with diligent follow-up inquiries to clarify any ambiguities or potential red flags. This includes scrutinizing the applicant's past interactions with law enforcement, even if they did not result in formal charges or convictions, to ascertain if they demonstrate a pattern of behavior that could render the applicant a danger to themselves or others. The U.S. Virgin Islands Code, specifically Title 23, Chapter 17, outlines the criteria for firearm permits, emphasizing the applicant's character and suitability. A licensing officer's duty is to uphold these standards by investigating any information that might suggest the applicant does not meet the good moral character or peaceable disposition requirements implicitly or explicitly stated within the law, even if the information is not a direct criminal conviction. This proactive and comprehensive due diligence is crucial for responsible firearm licensing. An approach that dismisses information solely because it does not constitute a formal conviction is professionally unacceptable. The law does not require a conviction to deny a license if the licensing authority has reasonable grounds to believe the applicant poses a risk. Ignoring or downplaying past incidents, such as documented domestic disturbances or credible reports of violent behavior, even without arrests or convictions, represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the public safety mandate. Similarly, relying solely on the absence of a criminal record without investigating other relevant information would be a dereliction of duty. The licensing process is not merely a check of a criminal database. It is an assessment of an individual's overall suitability, an approach that prioritizes expediency over thoroughness. By accepting the application at face value without further investigation into potentially disqualifying information, also fails to meet professional standards and could lead to the issuance of a permit to an unsuitable individual. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant statutes and regulations. This framework should include a systematic review of all application materials, followed by a proactive investigation of any information that raises concerns, regardless of its formal legal status. This involves cross-referencing information, conducting background checks beyond simple criminal records, and making reasoned judgments based on the totality of the circumstances, always prioritizing public safety while adhering to due process for the applicant. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a firearm dealer operating in the U.S. Virgin Islands is presented with a purchase request for a handgun from a resident of St. Thomas. The customer presents a valid firearm permit issued by a different U.S. state. What is the most appropriate course of action for the dealer to ensure compliance with U.S. Virgin Islands law? Option A. Proceed with the sale, as the customer's residency and out-of-territory permit are sufficient for the purchase. Option B. Complete the sale and advise the customer to register the firearm themselves with the U.S. Virgin Islands authorities after the purchase. Option C. Verify the customer possesses a valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm and confirm the firearm is eligible for registration within the U.S. Virgin Islands. Option D. Accept the out-of-territory firearm permit as valid for carrying a handgun within the U.S. Virgin Islands and complete the sale. The correct answer is C. Verify the customer possesses a valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm and confirm the firearm is eligible for registration within the U.S. Virgin Islands. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearm dealer in the U.S. Virgin Islands when a customer, a resident of St. Thomas, attempts to purchase a handgun. The core challenge lies in navigating the specific licensing and registration requirements mandated by the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, ensuring compliance with local law while facilitating a legitimate transaction. Failure to adhere to these regulations can result in severe penalties, including fines, license revocation, and criminal charges, impacting both the dealer's business and the customer's legal standing. Careful judgment is required to balance customer service with strict adherence to the law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves verifying the customer's valid U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm and ensuring the firearm being purchased is properly registered or eligible for registration in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This approach is correct because Title 23, Chapter 13 of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, specifically sections related to firearm permits and registration, mandates that individuals must possess a valid license to carry a handgun and that all firearms must be registered with the local authorities. A dealer has a legal obligation to confirm these prerequisites before completing a sale to prevent illegal firearm possession and transfers. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the sale based solely on the customer's residency and a valid out-of-territory firearm permit. This is a regulatory failure because U.S. Virgin Islands law requires a locally issued license for possession and carrying within the territory, and out-of-territory permits do not grant this authority. Another incorrect approach is to assume that if the customer has a valid permit from another U.S. jurisdiction, it automatically transfers or is recognized. This is a significant legal misinterpretation, as firearm laws are territorial, and reciprocity agreements, if any, must be explicitly understood and applied, which is not the default for carrying handguns in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Third incorrect approach is to complete the sale and inform the customer that they must register the firearm themselves later. This shifts the legal burden inappropriately and bypasses the dealer's responsibility to ensure the firearm is legally transferable and registered at the point of sale, or at least initiated through the proper channels by the dealer as required by law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in firearm sales must adopt a proactive compliance mindset. This involves thoroughly understanding the specific firearm laws of the jurisdiction in which they operate. When faced with a transaction, the decision-making process should prioritize verifying all required local permits and registration procedures. This includes consulting the relevant statutes, in this case, the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, seeking clarification from local law enforcement or licensing authorities if necessary, and maintaining meticulous records of all transactions and compliance checks. The guiding principle is to ensure that every sale is legal and compliant from the outset, protecting both the business and the customer from legal repercussions. Question 14. Implementation of responsible firearm ownership in the U.S. Virgin Islands requires a licensee to act promptly when their firearm is discovered missing. If a U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensee realizes their registered firearm is no longer in their possession, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Assume the firearm was misplaced and not reported unless it is later used in a crime. Option B. Wait a few days to search for the firearm thoroughly before reporting it to the authorities to avoid unnecessary alarm. Option C. Immediately contact the Virgin Islands Police Department (VIPD) to report the firearm as lost or stolen, providing all available details. Option D. Report the missing firearm only to the entity that issued the firearm license without notifying the VIPD. The correct answer is C. Immediately contact the Virgin Islands Police Department (VIPD) to report the firearm as lost or stolen, providing all available details. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearm licensee in the U.S. Virgin Islands who discovers their firearm is missing. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate need to report a potentially lost or stolen firearm, which could pose a public safety risk, with the legal requirements for reporting such an event under U.S. Virgin Islands law. A hasty or incomplete report could lead to regulatory penalties or hinder law enforcement's ability to recover the weapon. The best professional approach involves immediate and accurate reporting to the relevant authorities as mandated by U.S. Virgin Islands law. This includes contacting the Virgin Islands Police Department, VIPD, without delay to report the firearm missing. Prompt reporting is crucial for public safety, as it allows law enforcement to be aware of a potentially unsecured firearm and to initiate investigative measures. Furthermore, failing to report a lost or stolen firearm can have legal consequences for the licensee, potentially impacting their future ability to obtain or maintain a license. Adhering strictly to the reporting procedures outlined by the VIPD and the relevant firearm licensing statutes ensures compliance and demonstrates responsible firearm ownership. An incorrect approach would be to delay reporting the missing firearm while attempting to locate it independently. While the desire to recover one's property is understandable, the legal obligation to report a lost or stolen firearm to the authorities takes precedence. This delay could allow the firearm to fall into the wrong hands or be used in criminal activity before law enforcement is even aware of its absence, thereby creating a significant public safety risk and violating the licensee's duty to report. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to report the firearm as lost without providing all necessary details or to report it to an incorrect agency. Inaccurate or incomplete reporting can impede law enforcement's investigation and may not fulfill the legal requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing statutes. It is imperative that the report is made to the VIPD and includes all pertinent information, such as the firearm's make, model, serial number, and the circumstances surrounding its disappearance, to the best of the licensee's knowledge. Finally, assuming the firearm was simply misplaced and not reporting it until a later, more convenient time is also a critical failure. The law does not provide discretion for licensees to decide when reporting is necessary. The obligation is immediate upon discovery of the loss or theft. This inaction directly contravenes the spirit and letter of firearm safety regulations designed to protect the community. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes immediate compliance with legal reporting requirements when faced with a lost or stolen firearm. This involves understanding the specific reporting obligations under U.S. Virgin Islands law, acting swiftly to notify the VIPT, and providing accurate and complete information. The framework should emphasize that public safety and legal compliance are paramount, even when personal inconvenience or the desire to recover property is present. Question 15. To address the challenge of an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm who has documented past incidents of domestic disputes but no criminal convictions, which risk assessment approach best upholds the principles of public safety and due process? Option A. Conduct a thorough, individualized risk assessment considering the totality of the circumstances, including the nature of the past incidents, the applicant's current demeanor, and potentially seeking further information or evaluations if warranted. Option B. Automatically deny the license based solely on the presence of documented domestic disputes, regardless of whether they resulted in criminal charges. Option C. Prioritize the applicant's stated need for self-defense and issue the license, assuming the past incidents are not relevant without a formal conviction. Option D. Issue the license without further inquiry, as the absence of criminal convictions means the applicant meets the basic legal requirements. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough, individualized risk assessment considering the totality of the circumstances, including the nature of the past incidents, the applicant's current demeanor, and potentially seeking further information or evaluations if warranted. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge because the applicant's past behavior, while not resulting in a criminal conviction, raises significant concerns about their suitability to carry a firearm in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The licensing authority must balance the applicant's right to self-defense with the public's safety, requiring a nuanced risk assessment that goes beyond a simple check of criminal records. Careful judgment is needed to interpret the spirit of the law, not just its letter, in determining if the applicant poses an undue risk. The best approach involves a thorough, individualized risk assessment that considers the totality of the circumstances. This includes reviewing the documented history of domestic disputes, evaluating the applicant's current demeanor and stated reasons for seeking a license, and potentially seeking additional information or requiring a mental health evaluation if warranted by the nature of the past incidents. This approach aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands statutory framework for firearm licensing, which allows for denial based on factors that indicate a person may be a danger to themselves or others, even without a criminal conviction. The law implicitly requires an assessment of character and propensity for violence. An approach that solely relies on the absence of a criminal conviction is insufficient and ethically flawed. While a criminal record is a clear disqualifier, the absence of one does not automatically equate to suitability. The U.S. Virgin Islands law is designed to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of individuals who, by their actions, demonstrate a potential for misuse, regardless of formal legal pronouncements. Ignoring documented instances of aggressive or violent behavior, even if they did not lead to arrest or conviction, represents a failure to conduct a proper risk assessment and could compromise public safety. Another incorrect approach is to automatically deny the license based on the mere mention of domestic disputes without further investigation. Domestic disputes are serious. The U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework generally requires a basis for denial beyond mere accusation. A fair process necessitates an evaluation of the context and severity of these disputes and whether they indicate a pattern of behavior that poses a risk. Arbitrary denial without due diligence is procedurally unfair and may not withstand legal scrutiny. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the applicant's stated desire for self-defense above all other considerations, without adequately weighing the potential risks to the community, is also professionally unsound. The right to bear arms is not absolute and is subject to reasonable regulation to protect public safety. A responsible licensing authority must conduct a balanced assessment, considering both the applicant's rights and the community's well-being. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should include 1. A comprehensive review of all submitted documentation. 2. An evaluation of any reported incidents, even if not resulting in criminal charges. 3. Consideration of the applicant's stated purpose and current circumstances. 4. A determination of whether further investigation or evaluation is necessary. And 5. a decision based on a holistic assessment of the applicant's suitability in accordance with the U.S. Virgin Islands firearm licensing laws and public safety principles. Question 16. The review process indicates a discrepancy in an applicant's background check for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, specifically concerning a past restraining order that was reportedly dismissed. What is the most prudent course of action for the licensing authority to ensure compliance with U.S. Virgin Islands law? Option A. Forward the application to the U.S. Virgin Islands Police Department for a cursory review and await their recommendation without independent verification of the dismissal. Option B. Accept the applicant's statement that the restraining order was dismissed and proceed with the license approval without further inquiry. Option C. Immediately deny the application based on the presence of past restraining order, regardless of its dismissal status, to err on the side of caution. Option D. Conduct a detailed investigation into the circumstances surrounding the restraining order, including obtaining official court records of its dismissal and interviewing relevant parties if necessary, to determine if the applicant poses a current risk. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed investigation into the circumstances surrounding the restraining order, including obtaining official court records of its dismissal and interviewing relevant parties if necessary, to determine if the applicant poses a current risk. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential risk associated with an applicant's firearm license application in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to self-defense with the paramount public safety concerns mandated by the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. Specifically, Title 23, Chapter 17, Section 456 of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code outlines the criteria for firearm licensing, emphasizing the applicant's character, mental stability, and the absence of disqualifying criminal history or documented threats to public safety. The risk assessment must be thorough and objective, avoiding assumptions or biases. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of all submitted documentation, cross-referencing information with available public records and law enforcement databases, and conducting a thorough interview with the applicant. This method directly addresses the statutory requirements by gathering evidence to assess the applicant's suitability, including their history of responsible firearm ownership, any documented instances of domestic violence or mental health crises, and their stated reasons for seeking a license. This aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework, which requires licensing authorities to make an informed determination based on objective criteria to ensure public safety. An approach that relies solely on the applicant's self-reported information without independent verification is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the statutory obligation to conduct a due diligence investigation and could lead to the issuance of a license to an individual who poses a risk to themselves or others, violating the spirit and letter of Title 23, Chapter 17, Section 456. Another unacceptable approach is to deny the application based on unsubstantiated rumors or hearsay. Such a decision would be arbitrary and capricious, lacking the factual basis required by law and potentially infringing upon the applicant's rights. The licensing authority must base its decisions on concrete evidence and established legal grounds. Finally, an approach that prioritizes expediency over thoroughness, such as rubber stamping applications without adequate scrutiny, is also professionally deficient. This undermines the integrity of the licensing process and directly jeopardizes public safety, contravening the core purpose of firearm licensing regulations. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, professionals should employ a systematic risk assessment framework that includes information gathering, verification, applicant interviews, and a thorough evaluation against statutory criteria. This process should be documented meticulously to ensure accountability and transparency. Question 17. Examination of the data shows that an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has a past misdemeanor conviction for petty theft that occurred 5 years ago, for which they completed all court-ordered requirements. The applicant has no other criminal history and has never been involved in any incidents involving firearms. What is the most prudent approach for the applicant to take when completing their license application? Option A. Fully disclose the misdemeanor conviction, provide a detailed explanation of the circumstances, and include documentation demonstrating completion of all court-ordered requirements and any evidence of rehabilitation. Option B. Omit the misdemeanor conviction from the application, as it is a minor offense and not directly related to firearms. Option C. Briefly mention the misdemeanor conviction without providing any details or supporting documentation, assuming the licensing authority will understand. Option D. Focus solely on the fact that the conviction was not firearm-related, and assume this is sufficient to satisfy the licensing requirements. The correct answer is A. Fully disclose the misdemeanor conviction, provide a detailed explanation of the circumstances, and include documentation demonstrating completion of all court-ordered requirements and any evidence of rehabilitation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the U.S. Virgin Islands specific licensing requirements for carrying a firearm, which are designed to balance public safety with individual rights. The applicant's past behavior, even if not directly related to firearm misuse, could be interpreted by licensing authorities as indicative of a risk to public safety. A thorough and honest risk assessment is paramount to ensure compliance with the law and to demonstrate fitness for a license. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive and transparent self-assessment of any past legal or behavioral issues that might be relevant to firearm possession, coupled with a proactive effort to gather supporting documentation and present a clear, factual narrative to the licensing authority. This approach directly addresses the U.S. Virgin Islands licensing framework, which emphasizes an applicant's fitness and potential risk. By openly disclosing and explaining past issues and providing evidence of rehabilitation or mitigating circumstances, the applicant demonstrates honesty and a commitment to responsible firearm ownership, aligning with the spirit and letter of the law. This proactive disclosure allows the licensing authority to make an informed decision based on all relevant facts. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to disclose any past legal issues, even if they seem minor or unrelated to firearms, is a significant regulatory failure. The U.S. Virgin Islands licensing process expects full disclosure. Concealing information can lead to immediate denial of the application and potential future prohibitions. This approach violates the ethical principle of honesty and undermines the licensing authority's ability to conduct a proper risk assessment. Minimizing or downplaying the significance of past legal issues without providing context or evidence of rehabilitation is also problematic. While disclosure is important, a superficial presentation that attempts to gloss over potentially concerning behavior fails to satisfy the licensing authority's need for a complete understanding of the applicant's history and current suitability. This approach risks being perceived as disingenuous and may not adequately address the underlying concerns that the licensing authority is mandated to evaluate. Focusing solely on the fact that the past legal issues did not involve firearms, without considering how they might reflect on an applicant's judgment, temperament, or respect for the law, is an incomplete risk assessment. The U.S. Virgin Islands licensing requirements are not limited to direct firearm-related offenses. They consider an applicant's overall character and propensity for responsible behavior. This approach fails to acknowledge the broader implications of past conduct on an individual's fitness to carry a firearm. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a framework of full transparency, thorough self-reflection, and proactive engagement with regulatory requirements. This involves understanding the specific criteria for licensing in the relevant jurisdiction. In this case, the U.S. Virgin Islands, honestly evaluating one's own history against those criteria and preparing to provide comprehensive and truthful information. When past issues exist, the focus should be on presenting a complete picture, including context, mitigating factors, and evidence of positive change, rather than attempting to omit or minimize them. This approach builds trust with the licensing authority and increases the likelihood of a favorable outcome based on a complete and accurate assessment of risk. Question 18. Upon reviewing an application for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, an applicant discloses a history of seeking professional mental health counseling for anxiety and stress management several years ago. The applicant provides a letter from their therapist stating they are currently doing well. Which of the following approaches best facilitates the U.S. Virgin Islands Licensing Authority's risk assessment process and ensures compliance with Title 14, Chapter 13 of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code? Option A. Submit a brief statement indicating that any past mental health issues have been resolved and are no longer relevant to current firearm possession. Option B. Submit a detailed disclosure of all mental health treatment, including the specific nature of the conditions treated, dates of treatment, and a comprehensive letter from the treating mental health professional confirming the applicant is not a danger to themselves or others and is fit to possess a firearm. Option C. Provide only the general information about seeking counseling for anxiety and stress, along with the therapist's letter stating the applicant is doing well, as this addresses recent well-being. Option D. Refuse to provide any details about mental health history, citing privacy concerns, and rely solely on the absence of any current legal prohibitions. The correct answer is B. Submit a detailed disclosure of all mental health treatment, including the specific nature of the conditions treated, dates of treatment, and a comprehensive letter from the treating mental health professional confirming the applicant is not a danger to themselves or others and is fit to possess a firearm. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to accurately assess and disclose their history of mental health treatment in a manner that complies with the U.S. Virgin Islands stringent firearm licensing requirements. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to privacy with the public safety mandate inherent in firearm regulation. A nuanced understanding of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, specifically Title 14, Chapter 13, regarding the licensing of firearms is crucial. This chapter outlines the criteria for disqualification, which often includes conditions that could render an individual a danger to themselves or others. The risk assessment here is not about the applicant's current mental state in isolation, but about their past history and its potential relevance to future responsible firearm ownership, as interpreted by the licensing authority. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive and transparent disclosure of all relevant mental health treatment history, accompanied by supporting documentation from treating physicians or mental health professionals. This approach directly addresses the licensing authority's need to conduct a thorough risk assessment by providing detailed information, including the nature of the treatment, the duration, the diagnosis, if applicable and permissible to disclose, and importantly, a statement from a qualified professional confirming the applicant is not a danger to themselves or others and is fit to possess a firearm. The applicant proactively satisfies the requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. This demonstrates a commitment to responsible gun ownership and facilitates the licensing authority's ability to make an informed decision based on all available facts, aligning with the public safety objectives of the law. An incorrect approach would be to selectively disclose only recent or perceived minor mental health issues, omitting past significant treatment or diagnoses. This failure to provide a complete picture prevents the licensing authority from conducting a proper risk assessment as mandated by law. It is ethically problematic as it involves intentional omission of material facts, potentially misleading the authority and undermining the integrity of the licensing process. Such an omission could be interpreted as an attempt to conceal information that might lead to disqualification, violating the spirit and letter of the law. Another incorrect approach is to refuse to disclose any mental health history, citing privacy concerns without understanding the specific legal carve-outs for firearm licensing. While privacy is a fundamental right, the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, like many jurisdictions, allows for the disclosure of certain personal information when it is directly relevant to public safety and required by law for licensing purposes. This refusal to cooperate with a lawful request for information necessary for a risk assessment would likely result in an automatic denial of the license, as it prevents the authority from fulfilling its statutory duty. Finally, providing vague or generalized statements about mental well-being without specific details or professional endorsements is also an inadequate approach. While not as egregious as outright omission, it fails to provide the concrete evidence needed for a thorough risk assessment. The licensing authority requires more than mere assurances. They need documented evidence of treatment and professional opinions to support the applicant's fitness to carry a firearm, as contemplated by the U.S. Virgin Islands legal framework. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes full transparency and proactive engagement with the licensing authority. This involves understanding the specific disclosure requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, gathering all relevant medical and psychological records, and obtaining professional assessments that directly address the applicant's fitness to possess a firearm. The goal is to provide the licensing authority with the necessary information to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, thereby demonstrating the applicant's commitment to responsible firearm ownership and public safety. Question 19. When evaluating a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm application from an individual with a documented history of domestic disputes, what is the most prudent risk assessment approach to ensure compliance with public safety mandates and relevant statutes? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of all available records pertaining to the domestic disputes, including police reports, court documents, and any issued protective orders, to assess the applicant's history, the severity of the incidents, and any legal outcomes, while also considering evidence of rehabilitation. Option B. Rely exclusively on the applicant's personal testimony regarding the domestic disputes without seeking independent verification from official sources. Option C. Automatically deny the application based on the mere presence of domestic dispute records, regardless of the circumstances or the time elapsed since the incidents. Option D. Expediently approve the application if the applicant claims the domestic disputes were minor misunderstandings and no criminal charges were ultimately filed. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of all available records pertaining to the domestic disputes, including police reports, court documents, and any issued protective orders, to assess the applicant's history, the severity of the incidents, and any legal outcomes, while also considering evidence of rehabilitation. Explanation. The scenario of a firearm license applicant with a history of domestic disputes presents a significant professional challenge for a licensing authority in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The core challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to self-defense and potential lawful ownership of a firearm against the paramount public safety interest and the specific requirements of the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. A thorough risk assessment is crucial to prevent the issuance of a license to an individual who may pose a danger to themselves or others. The most appropriate approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's entire history, with a particular focus on the nature and severity of the domestic disputes, the outcome of any legal proceedings, and any evidence of rehabilitation or ongoing risk. This approach aligns with the spirit and letter of U.S. Virgin Islands law, which mandates that licensing authorities consider the applicant's character and suitability, and specifically prohibits issuing licenses to individuals who have been convicted of certain offenses or who pose a risk to public safety. A detailed examination of the domestic dispute records, including police reports, court documents, and any restraining orders, is essential to determine if the applicant meets the disqualifying criteria or presents an unacceptable risk. This thoroughness ensures compliance with the public safety mandate inherent in firearm licensing. An approach that dismisses the domestic disputes as minor or irrelevant without a detailed investigation is professionally unacceptable. Such an approach fails to adequately assess the applicant's risk profile and could violate the U.S. Virgin Islands Code's requirement to consider suitability. Similarly, automatically denying the license solely based on the existence of domestic disputes, without a nuanced evaluation of the circumstances, the applicant's history since the disputes, and any mitigating factors, may be overly broad and not in accordance with a fair and thorough risk assessment process. Finally, relying solely on the applicant's self-reported information about the disputes, without independent verification through official records, constitutes a significant failure in due diligence and a potential breach of regulatory requirements. Professionals tasked with evaluating firearm license applications should employ a systematic risk assessment framework. This framework begins with identifying all relevant disqualifying factors as outlined in the U.S. Virgin Islands Code. It then requires gathering comprehensive information from all available sources, including official records, interviews, and background checks. The gathered information must be critically analyzed to assess the credibility of the applicant, the severity of past incidents, and the likelihood of future risk. The decision-making process should be documented meticulously, demonstrating a clear rationale based on the evidence and applicable law, thereby ensuring accountability and transparency. Question 20. The analysis reveals that an applicant for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm has submitted a risk assessment report. The report quantifies the perceived threat level based on the frequency of reported violent crimes within a 1-mile radius of their residence over the past 5 years, the average severity score of these crimes, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being most severe, and the applicant's daily commute distance through areas with a higher incidence of reported property crimes. The applicant's data yields the following: average annual violent crimes in the 1-mile radius, 15 average severity score of violent crimes, 5 daily commute distance through high-incidence property crime areas, 8 miles. The applicant proposes a risk score calculation as follows. Risk score equals average annual violent crimes * average severity score plus daily commute distance * 2. Calculate the applicant's proposed risk score and determine if this calculation, as presented, sufficiently quantifies a proper reason for a U.S. Virgin Islands license to carry a firearm, assuming the licensing authority requires a minimum quantifiable risk score of 150 to consider a proper reason for self-defense. Option A. The applicant's risk score is 179. This calculation directly quantifies a demonstrable threat level by incorporating both violent crime frequency and severity, along with the risk associated with their commute, thereby meeting the minimum threshold for a proper reason. Option B. The applicant's risk score is 129. This calculation is insufficient because it does not adequately weigh the severity of violent crimes against their frequency, failing to meet the minimum threshold for a proper reason. Option C. The applicant's risk score is 129. This calculation is problematic as it uses an arbitrary multiplier for the commute distance, which is not a standard metric for assessing firearm necessity under U.S. Virgin Islands law. Option D. The applicant's risk score is 179. While this score exceeds the minimum threshold, the calculation is flawed because it does not account for the applicant's personal vulnerability or any prior incidents involving the applicant. The correct answer is A. The applicant's risk score is 179. This calculation directly quantifies a demonstrable threat level by incorporating both violent crime frequency and severity, along with the risk associated with their commute, thereby meeting the minimum threshold for a proper reason. Explanation: the analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between an individual's right to self-defense and the government's responsibility to ensure public safety through regulated firearm ownership. The U.S. Virgin Islands, like other jurisdictions, balances these interests through a licensing system that requires applicants to demonstrate not only a need for carrying a firearm, but also a capacity to do so responsibly and without posing an undue risk. The mathematical component introduces a layer of objective assessment, requiring the applicant to quantify and justify their perceived risk, and the licensing authority to evaluate this quantification. This necessitates a careful, evidence-based approach that adheres strictly to the established legal framework for firearm licensing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The correct approach involves a meticulous and quantifiable assessment of risk, directly addressing the statutory requirements for demonstrating a genuine need and the absence of disqualifying factors. This approach aligns with the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, Title 23, Chapter 14, which governs the licensing of firearms. Specifically, it requires applicants to demonstrate a proper reason for carrying a firearm, which often involves a demonstrable threat to life or property. The mathematical component in this context serves as a tool to quantify the perceived threat level. For instance, calculating the frequency of reported incidents in a specific area, the severity of those incidents, and the applicant's proximity to such events can provide a data-driven basis for the proper reason. A risk score derived from such calculations, when presented alongside supporting documentation and a clear narrative, allows the licensing authority to objectively evaluate the applicant's claim against the statutory criteria. This method prioritizes evidence and adherence to legal standards, ensuring that licensing decisions are grounded in fact rather than speculation. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on subjective feelings of insecurity or anecdotal evidence without a quantifiable basis. For example, a generalized statement about crime rates without specific data tied to the applicant's circumstances or a calculation of potential threat severity would likely be insufficient. This fails to meet the proper reason standard by not providing a demonstrable, objective justification. Another incorrect approach would be to present a complex mathematical model that is not directly tied to the statutory requirements or the applicant's specific circumstances. While mathematical sophistication might be present, if it doesn't clearly articulate a quantifiable need as defined by the U.S. Virgin Islands Code, it becomes irrelevant to the licensing decision. A third incorrect approach would be to inflate or misrepresent data to artificially increase a risk score. This constitutes a failure of honesty and integrity, which are implicit ethical requirements for any applicant seeking a license that involves public safety. Such misrepresentation undermines the entire licensing process and would be grounds for denial. The professional decision-making process for such situations requires a systematic evaluation of the applicant's submission against the explicit legal criteria. Professionals must first understand the statutory definition of a proper reason in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They should then assess whether the applicant's presented information, including any mathematical calculations, directly supports this definition. The focus should be on the clarity, relevance, and accuracy of the data and calculations, and how they collectively demonstrate a quantifiable need that aligns with the law. Professionals must be trained to identify when subjective claims are being presented as objective data, and when mathematical tools are being used appropriately to quantify risk versus being used as a smokescreen.